Welcome back to the latest venture into the DBL as Season 6 has arrived. Let's just get this going because we have no time to waste as the league takes on an additional 2 teams, expanding to a 12-team league for the first time in DBL history, with an abundance of trades, moves, and exciting acquisitions that have already happened, plus many more still to come. Let's see who ranks in 12th. It might shock some of you to learn that I don't have either of the expansion teams finishing in last place. Instead, I got my sights set on the Maryland McLovins. Matt and CJ will probably try harder to do well, or at the very least be competitive in some way, but the McLovins are arguably on track for the biggest tank job in league history. Last season, Josh began with a confusing structure in place, leaving Maryland fans scratching their heads and wondering what the direction of their favorite team would look like. But after a draft that saw Josh select rookies and young pieces, he made it clear that it was time for the once champion McLovins to finally enter a rebuild. Maryland went on to go 3-16 as well as finish in last place, seeing Josh deliver a professional presentation on gay porn.
Then the year after that, in the 80s, when storylines started to develop for people and things got a little bit more intense and all that, so I was like, how exciting. So that's when things started going on like VHS tapes.
The front office shipped off talented players all year long, such as Donovan Mitchell, Trae Young, Rudy Gobert, Paul George, and more to stockpile a bevy of first-rounders and juicy draft capital. It was a terrifically managed season in my opinion, as I had been clamoring for the McLovins to go this route for a few years, and while it sucks to admit your team isn't good enough to win while you suffer with a bad record, being in the mix for the last place punishment, and receiving an all-dumbass selection, tanking is always worth it to eventually turn your team into a future juggernaut. But you have to go about it the right way, which I have faith in Josh to do, being that he has 5 first-round picks in the 2025 draft, plus many more for years to come. We've seen teams try to rush their success, which has just delayed any real chance at building a dynasty, and we've seen teams like the Tropics, who rebuilt for about 3 years before getting any real stardom and recognition. You gotta be patient and unafraid to fail, but as long as the McLovins keep that philosophy in place and don't randomly begin a push for the playoffs this season, or even next, I think Maryland fans will be thrilled to see what the front office cooks up. Honestly, these keepers are flat out garbage, but I know that's Josh's intention as he plans to tank and scout all the young talent he can. The hope is that all of these guys, or at least most of them, can turn into something special this season or next, but the odds all of them pan out are highly unlikely too, at least within the next few years. Starting off with Miles Bridges, he may be the best player that the McLovins secured for Season 6, but that's why he's the worst keeper here too, right? Obviously, Josh can trade him for a few decent picks, or even hold on to him since he's still relatively young, but does he really want to begin a fresh start and new look McLovins team with an abuser and wife beater? Can we actually as a league just collectively not trade for Miles Bridges, even if he skyrockets to like 30 fantasy points? Screw that guy. I don't blame Josh, he averaged 25 fantasy points the last 2 seasons he was available, but employing Bridges for 2 years straight is enough for me to justify him being a bad keeper. Getting to Maryland's second Hornet, Brandon Miller has star potential. He had a rather bland rookie campaign, but really flashed a lot of upside towards the end of the year. He may never sniff the heights of Wemby's fantasy output, but I can see him improving to the likes of 21 fantasy points this year, which of course wouldn't be amazing, but would be excellent progression for Miller as just a second-year player in the McLovins' current timeline. Jabari Smith Jr. also raised his stats and efficiency last year, averaging 20.4 fantasy points after a bit of a disastrous rookie go. In his third year, I still see him getting better, but also foresee a world where it's not really shown in his fantasy averages. There's such a logjam of young guys that are trying to showcase they're the alphas of the team, and with another likely boost to Sengun's game alone, it might be tough for Jabari to outdo 21 to 22 fantasy points. I'll still happily take that though, as long as Smith doesn't decline in minutes or production. But speaking of Houston, let's talk about 2 more of those young guys in Jalen Green and Amen Thompson. Jalen Green is a really weird and frustrating player at this point, like he's kind of absolute dog water for the first 2/3 of every season, and then always goes on a scorcher in the final frame of the schedule that makes him look like he's the greatest player of all time. Was last year's performance enough to fool us all again, or can we continue to be optimistic since he's only played 3 seasons and is still super young? I still don't have much faith in him until it's a consistent experience with Green, not to mention Reed Shepherd and the plethora of other talent like I already said. I still don't really see Green eclipsing 20 fantasy points, but since Josh is tanking, it's a more than fair keeper to take on. The next rocket up is Amen Thompson, and I have to give kudos to Josh for not only drafting him, but hanging on to him all year long, even when he got no playtime and did nothing for the first half of the season. Patience is a virtue though, and the first Thompson twin is looking like a nightly triple-double threat so long as he actually gets minutes, which I'm still not very certain of. That's the beauty of a rebuild though. Who gives a fuck? Let's just see how this all pans out. At least his brother Asar, who Josh also kept, is a bit more guaranteed for minutes. I think Amen is probably like a lot better, but Asar still has upside, even if I I don't see him making much of a difference from last year's numbers, namely because it's hard to just trust Detroit in anything they do. The McLovin's second Piston is Jaden Ivey, who has also been a confounding commodity for fantasy owners. He flashed some real potential in his rookie season, but backtracked that progress in his sophomore stint when he was relegated to a bench role for some weird-ass reason. Eventually, he rejoined the starting unit, but it was too little too late to make any impact at all. Are we going to see him develop or not this year? It's hard to tell, but when I'm rebuilding, I'm willing to take that chance and see. The same could be said for Josh's final keeper and fourth H-Town representative in Cam Whitmore. He seems like a skilled talent that could hypothetically be a star player in the future, but we're not expecting that this season, right? With all the other Houston products on the Rockets, half of them who are McLovin teammates, there'd have to be a long list of injuries or a huge influx in Whitmore's minutes for him to be worthy of not only a keeper spot, but being rostered at all. Again, in Josh's circumstance, why not hold on to a guy if you think he's going to be an all-star caliber player? My only real issue is that 4 of these keepers are Rockets, 2 of them are Pistons, and 2 of them are Hornets. That's going to be a problem when it comes to Maryland's schedule, and most of these keepers aren't really doing him any favors anyway, so it's going to be a hard pill to swallow for 22 consecutive weeks. That does appear to be Josh's game plan though, so he'll have to just bite the bullet to eventually reach his ultimate vision. When we slide over to his draft, Josh continued to deploy the same formula and ideology to his selections as he didn't take a single player that has stepped foot onto an NBA court yet. With the 4th overall pick, the McLovin secured Alex Sarr, which was the obvious choice. He's probably going to be somewhat in the race for Rookie of the Year, or at the very least make an all-rookie team. That may not be saying much since this draft class is pure booty cheeks, and Sarr was atrocious in Summer League, but he still has a lot of potential to be a great player moving forward, and he obviously fits the Maryland timeline. With his second pick of the first round, Josh made history by completing the first ever draft day trade when he partnered up with CJ to receive the 6th overall pick in exchange for the 9th overall pick, as well as a future 3rd and 4th rounder. Although it seems like Josh may have given away a couple of picks for nothing, because I don't think anyone between 6 and 9 were looking to select Donovan Clingan, I gotta respect the trade to move up for someone you want. Look, if Clingan was the surefire starter in Portland or anywhere, he'd probably be the frontrunner for Rookie of the Year. Unfortunately, he's playing behind DeAndre Ayton, so I don't think he's going to be consistently impactful, but this is also a really good pick for the McLovins. These rookies who have clear potential and could even put up big numbers from time to time this year are unquestionably the kinds of assets Josh should be monitoring and stashing. But after those picks, it starts to reach a point where it feels like Maryland is getting carried away. I don't necessarily mind Stephon Castle either, who could be a solid scoring guard in the future, but I don't reckon he'll offer much production this season. I get that's the point, and the McLovins are trying to tank, and they just want a bunch of young talent to choose from, but it becomes a bit egregious with the selections of Jared McCain and Tidjane Salaün? What? Even if these two become serviceable NBA players, it's not happening this year. The McLovins will be unable to trade these two for anything because no one wants an unproven player that hasn't shown anything yet, and it's not like Maryland's going to bring them back as keepers with the rest of their young core, so what is Josh's game plan here? I know the overarching game plan, but Josh isn't going to be able to improve his team if he can't trade anyone on his roster. At least a couple of veterans or guys that are actually going to get legit playtime would make sense. Overall, this draft is a mixed bag for me because clearly it's in Josh's best interest to select and operate this way, but there is such a thing as going overboard, and in this scenario, I think that's what happened. I rock with Sarr and Clingan, and Castle I'm okay with, but the last two were misses that really don't have any business being on a DBL roster. In the end, the McLovins are on the verge of being historically bad. This is a good thing because Josh needed to commit to this direction in full force in order to carve out a legit dynasty in the future, but a tough pill to swallow when it likely means the season results in an all-dumbass selection and last place punishment. I'm interested to see what he does this year because other than a few lottery teams that might want to take on some young and inconsistent talent, I don't think there's going to be much room for trade negotiations in Maryland. They have like one veteran to part with in Miles Bridges, and nobody wants that asshole either. Contenders are going to be looking elsewhere to bulk up for the playoffs, but as long as Josh doesn't mind riding the wave of losses that are sure to come his way, this is going to be a good season in terms of unadulterated tank jobs. He'll have some tough decisions to make when it comes to analyzing his array of young players, but that's a pretty good position to be in too. In 11th place this year, I have our only true newcomer taking on an expansion team with the Bikini Bottom Brawlers. By starting from scratch and keeping what essentially equates to leftovers in the expansion draft, Matt is at a clear disadvantage heading into his first year with the DBL. Aside from that though, Matt may be the most seasoned newcomer we've ever had. Although he's missed 5 previous seasons in the DBL, he's accustomed to the fantasy format we partake in and is no stranger to the way things work. His only other disadvantage will be figuring out how the trade market works between all of the teams and members, but otherwise, Matt is probably the most experienced rookie we've ever seen enter our world. But even with that positive spin and the chance to build something strong in Bikini Bottom, the talent gap is going to serve as a struggle in his first rodeo with Delta Beta Lambda. As I go through these keepers, keep in mind that I feel better about them than I would if they were anyone else's outside of CJ, and maybe even including him since he's been in the league before, but they were expansion teams, so it's expected to be more of a struggle. Given the circumstances, I understand choices and keepers that I probably would not have been as kind to if they were on other teams. That being said, Brandon Ingram shouldn't be on the Brawlers, because he should have been kept by another team. That was my choice, I dropped him for nothing, but I wasn't going to entertain a third-round pick for a guy that's proven enough to probably be worth just a second. Anyway, for Matt's sake, this is a fantastic keeper for him to obtain since he's like a legit keeper and not just a quote-unquote expansion keeper. I have issues with him, that's why I didn't keep him myself, obviously. He has injury concerns and only averaged 23 fantasy points last year, but he's consistently been a 24 to 25 guy over the past few seasons, and although he hasn't taken another step and probably hit his ceiling at this point, this is a great guy to have in the depths of Bikini Bottom. Hartenstein had an impressive campaign last year and is looking to start in OKC come opening day. I have some question marks about whether or not he's going to get a starter's workload though, and I definitely don't view him as a franchise corner piece, but again, who the fuck was Matt supposed to take? I think he could average close to 24 fantasy points and could be a trade candidate to get the Brawlers some lucrative assets. Up next is Devin Vassell, and he was a bit disappointing last season, but also a bit surprising. He started off bad and ended pretty good. I think he takes another step alongside Wemby with Chris Paul aiding his development, so I don't think 22 plus fantasy points is out of the question as he looks to stay in Bikini Bottom long term. He's beginning the year injured, which isn't a good sign, and there is a lot of guard minutes to go around, but he's still one of the Spurs' best players. I'm not a big Simons guy, but there's still a chance he can tap into greater fantasy relevance. I don't really think that's going to happen as long as he's surrounded by Scoot Henderson, Shaden Sharp, Delano Banton, and all the other players looking to put up numbers in Portland, but he has a high scoring ceiling which is always going to be intriguing. He can't really do much else, but maybe this year he turns things up another notch. His teammate in Denny Avdia I think I may prefer a little more since he averaged more fantasy points last year and can contribute in all categories, but I also get the impression he may have reached his ceiling to some degree. I think he'll get less touches than he did in Washington too. While both are horrible teams, there's clearly more talent and ball-dominant players in Portland. He does have titillating upside, but I'm a bit cautious of what he'll bring to the table. It's tough for me to get too excited about Okongwu since I've been expecting him to take over as the Hawks center for the past 3 years, but there's no better team than the Brawlers to take the chance on that. Capella has to be on the way out soon, or eventually get relegated to a backup, and Okongwu has flashed the potential when he gets minutes to be a lethal fantasy big man. If it doesn't happen again, I'd expect like 19 fantasy points this year. Next we've got Kobe White, and I'm just confused about him. Is he starting at shooting guard, and even if he was, can he maintain 20 fantasy points with Levine back, Giddey controlling the offense, Lonzo Ball returning, and Ayo Dosunmu sharing the court? Even if he can, 20 fantasy points isn't really anything to write home about, but as a young player with room to grow who finished second in MIP voting last year, I don't absolutely hate it. Finally comes Matt's third Blazer, and that would be Shaden Sharp, who's in the same boat as Simons, but worse since he hasn't shown the ability to necessarily score 25 a game like Simons can. I think he can be a special player if given the opportunity, but we're not there yet. He may be worth holding though, as the Brawlers eyeball their young assets. Overall, yeah, I mean there's not a lot of immediate impact players here, but there's still names to get excited about if you live in a pineapple under the sea. I think Vassell, Ingram, and Hartenstein will all be valuable to Bikini Bottom this year, and while the other guys remain kind of up in the air, a bulk of them could certainly pan out just this season alone. And the same could be said for the guys they chose in the draft, but I'm not going to say it. Again, give Matt the benefit of the doubt as not only a first-year member, but having to build his team from the ground up as an expansion club. There's not a lot of enticing names to choose from, which probably explains the pick of Taylor Hendricks in the first round. This guy could be good, but he only averaged 12 fantasy points as a rookie, and the Jazz haven't cleared up frontcourt space to suggest he's going to get more playing time. If anything, it may be worse with the addition of Kyle Flipowski. In the second round came what probably was Matt's best pick with Keontae George, another Jazz selection. He averaged 13-4-3 and made an all-rookie team, displaying some sort of flash that can hopefully be unlocked as the starting point guard in his sophomore year. I can see his numbers going up to like 16 points and 6 assists, even if that's on shitty efficiency and only 18 fantasy points a game. That's still the kind of intriguing hope that the Brawlers want to attach themselves to. In the third round, Bikini Bottom went with Ron Holland, and I don't really mind this either. I mean, I don't have faith he's going to be too impressive this season because not only is he a rookie and coming off the bench, but he's a Piston, and they don't have a great track record as an organization or with player development. So I kind of like it because the Brawlers are not going to be competing and should toy with rookies and unproven guys, but at the same time, I don't really know if this is going to be someone Matt will be keeping by year's end. Trey Murphy went in the fourth round, and the moment sort of passed for me with him. As long as he's on the Pelicans and a part of their crowded rotation, I don't see him being too relevant. We've been waiting on a breakout for him for like the past 3 seasons, and while that could always be right around the corner, I don't think he's going to have the ball enough between Zion, Ingram, DeJounte, and McCollum to average over 16 fantasy points. With his last pick, Matt chose the well-known superstar Noah Clowney, who averaged a robust 5 points and 3 rebounds last year. All jokes aside, this is probably not going to amount to anything as like the third string power forward, and that's if you count Ben Simmons as a point guard too. The Nets will be in the running for the worst team of all time, so there will be some revolutionarily bad tanking lineups out there that Clowney could be a part of, but he's just not going to get enough minutes to be rostered. You never know, maybe he impresses his way into more playing time, but I don't think he's averaging over 12 fantasy points. Again, you can't really give Matt a hard time based on the position he was put in. This whole year is going to be a learning curve, never mind the draft. I think Keontae George could find his future home in Bikini Bottom, and Ron Holland is an understandable choice too that could pay off, but the rest of this draft really isn't doing it for me. The Brawlers are going to be in for a rough debut season in the DBL, but I'm hoping at the very least Matt has fun battling league opponents, participating in tweets and DBL Twitter, and in general just figuring out how our world works. I'm sure he wants to be bad, so he has a chance to secure a high pick in next year's draft, but it's still going to be an emasculating situation to deal with week in and week out. However, I know Matt as a very knowledgeable fantasy competitor, so in a few years when he gets the ball rolling, Bikini Bottom could be a legit playoff team. The dynasty starts now, Brawlers. How will you respond? Let's not really act like the next projection wouldn't be the other expansion team, as I've got CJ's return to the DBL resulting in a 10th place finish. The Nice have a huge leg up over Matt, and arguably some of the newer GMs in the league, such as Alec and Gian, due to being a member for 4 years before last season's abrupt departure. Now CJ's back with a vengeance and ready to give it his all, but that's still not going to stop him from having an unceremonious homecoming. Being in the same boat as Matt with a freshly invented expansion team, CJ's keepers aren't exactly up to par with the rest of the leagues. He knows how the trade market generally runs and understands the scoring format, but starting with a lesser level of skill will make it difficult to make noise this year. At the same time, though, I gotta hand it to CJ for doing a pretty admirable job with what he was given. We all know that Kessler didn't pan out last season after finishing third in the Rookie of the Year race 2 seasons ago, but he's still super young, and as we know with rebounding and shot blocking big men in our league, could be a future DBL superstar. Now, it's not great news that for 2 years straight he wasn't given the minutes and workload to shine, especially after an impressive debut season, and even more so worrisome being that he's on a non-threat in the Jazz, but in the blink of an eye, can you really tell me with a straight face that Kessler's numbers couldn't have been Jalen Duren's last year if awarded 30 minutes a night? It might not be this season, but a breakout is coming. And debatably a keeper that I like even more would be Immanuel Quickley. I was hoping he'd go undrafted in the expansion and I'd be able to snag him in the league draft, but that's wishful thinking for a guy who's probably going to average 20 points, 7 assists, and 5 rebounds. Maybe a bit inefficiently, but he's got that Tyrese Maxey type of potential, and I'm excited to see what he could do. Next up is Trace Jackson Davis, and at first, I was a bit bewildered that he was picked in the expansion. I guess I just didn't think people thought that highly of him after a fine rookie year, but after looking at the numbers, he averaged 8 points, 5 rebounds, an assist, and a block in just 16 minutes per game last year. Kevon Looney is kind of old and washed, and the youth movement is coming in faster than you'd expect with Golden State. I'm expecting a jump in playtime around at least 22 minutes a game, and if he starts and gets a legit workload, he could definitely be averaging over 23 fantasy points. Maybe that's a bit too optimistic, maybe he's still a few years away from being relevant, but the Nice have all the time in the world to see what he's capable of. His teammate in Jonathan Kuminga is proof that the Warriors are going to be going young, and I expect him to be the second option offensively and average over 20 points per game. I need to see him contribute in other stat categories more before I stamp him as a bona fide star, but he's going to provide a pretty consistent dosage of 22 plus fantasy points this year and might have the highest ceiling out of everyone in Minnesota's core. Kuzma is next, and he was one of the best veteran players available. He's going to give you 23 fantasy points a night as long as he's the leader of a bad team like the Wizards, but if he's ever traded to a contender or playoff hopeful, his value will likely drop significantly. So obviously not the future of the Nice, but he could be worth a few draft picks if a contender wants to improve their team for the postseason. I've been off the Beal train for a few years now, but he's still one of the best players taken in the expansion draft for his name value and scoring tendencies. He wasn't very good last season, and he's always injured, but if he can get into a groove, he could be relied upon for like 22 fantasy points, and that's certainly serviceable for Minnesota. Simmons also could theoretically average 22 fantasy points, but it's only going to be across like 12 games on the season. I was surprised CJ took him given his expressive views against the former Sixer, but if he actually plays, he will put up Draymond numbers, especially on a Nets team that has nobody. I just really don't think he's going to play. Like 30 games would be a miracle at this point, not even joking. Last and probably least, we have Jordan Poole, the player CJ hoped to kickstart his Shore Monsters franchise with, but was spared of a horrible campaign when he bowed out of the league. Poole was the most disappointing player of Season 5 because most of us had high expectations for him considering his new situation. I wish CJ looked elsewhere because after what I saw last year, like, I can't even imagine this guy will ever be a good basketball player again, but at the same time, I guess you never know. Maybe it was just an absolutely weird and abysmal season, and this year he will feel more confident with his surroundings and comfortable in his role and give us something like 23 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists. It's possible, but not probable after last season. I do think he'll be improving from that hellish campaign, but I don't think it's going to be enough to actually beat roster. I would have preferred to see him taken as a flyer in the actual draft. All that said though, I think CJ did a pretty marvelous job considering I believe 7 of these guys could be averaging over 20 fantasy points this year. There's only a handful of other teams that I believe have the core capable of doing that. Just like the Brawlers, it may not all pan out in this upcoming season, but I'm already getting a sense of what the nice foundation will look like, and I am fully on board. But when we move over to CJ's draft, it's a bit lukewarm in my eyes. I understand completely taking veterans and well-known roster fillers like Aaron Gordon and Austin Reeves, a strategy I wish Josh implored more into his draft, but I have the opposite remark for CJ. I wish he went more youthful and tried to land 1 or 2 rookies or players with potential. He accepted a smart, history-making trade by moving down to number 9 from number 6, and what we almost universally agree is a supremely weak draft class, but he still could have went with a Matas Buzelis, a Stephon Castle, or an Andrew Nembhard or something. Someone that has the ability to become more than what they currently are. Austin Reeves has a slight chance of that happening, but I really wouldn't count on a bigger workload than last year. So between him, Aaron Gordon, Wendell Carter Jr., Terrence Mann, and Paul Reed, there isn't a guy in this pool that will be remaining with the team. That was clearly the intention of the Nice, but they and the McLovins needed to meet in the middle and try for the best of both worlds. Ironic they completed that trade together. At best, Austin Reeves and Aaron Gordon will conjure up a couple of thirds, which is cool, but at least in Reeves' case, he was a first-round pick. Wendell might have a small resurgence after only averaging 17 fantasy points last year, but there's more feelings of pessimism surrounding him this year than positivity. Like maybe he'll be good enough to hold on to if he can return to 22 plus fantasy points, but if he's looking to move him, again, that's like maybe a third and a fourth in return. I don't really mind that one, I guess, because in the third round there were a lot of scraps and it's basically just a guessing game, but that's why I wish he went with more projects in the earlier rounds than people that have already hit their ceiling at like 21 to 22 fantasy points. T-Man doesn't have PG in LA anymore, but I still think he is who he is now because like 3 or 4 years ago was supposed to be his coming out party and it still hasn't happened. And Paul Reed, yeah, I think he's going to be dropped within 2 weeks. Once more, CJ took on an expansion team, and that is not an easy task. You are not going to be able to assemble the best talent, and you're going to have to suffer through some harrowing losses, but at the same time, I make this video yearly to tell my opinions like they are without sugarcoating it. If I were in the Minnesota front office, I would try to get back on the phone with Josh and make some smaller deals to get a few of the plethora of 20-year-olds the McLovins currently possess. Veteran for rookie trade straight up, I think would actually benefit both teams. On the whole, I really do think CJ may have struck gold with a couple of his keepers. They may not develop this season, but they're on the way, and that's an exciting circumstance to be in. On the other hand, the Nice are still going to be bad. Their draft didn't help their chances at building much more, and their end of roster vets will wind up being moved for a small price. I'd be surprised if this team wins over 4 games, but being in the C group with the McLovins and Brawlers has to give them a slight edge to grab a couple of W's. Next up with a 9th place finish will be the Magic City Mad Hatters. Gian entered the league last year in order to take over Sam's former ball club and already applied more effort and care to the franchise than the previous GM ever did. It wasn't exactly smooth sailing as Gian missed the playoffs and made some ill-advised choices along the way, but he still entered the year with a 10-9 record and tried his best to improve the roster. Gian managed to get Jimmy Butler, Rudy Gobert, and Paul George on a roster that was already pretty intimidating with the likes of SGA, LeBron, Curry, DeJounte, and Ingram. He He may have given away most of his future, but it was a ballsy and courageous move. The sad truth is that Sam kind of wasted away the talents of the team, letting LeBron, Curry, and Westbrook rot away in their old age and left Gian to pick up the pieces. I admire the fact that Gian went for it last year because honestly, you might as well put all your chips into one basket for one last ride to attempt a chance at contention, because if he hadn't, it would just be a middle-of-the-road borderline playoff team. Unfortunately, Gian did all that and it was still just a middle-of-the-road borderline playoff team, only one that couldn't even make the playoffs. So my problem now is I don't know what the hell Magic City is doing. They hinted at a rebuild by trading away franchise alums at last year's deadline, such as DeJounte Murray and Brandon Ingram, who have never played for another team before that moment. He also swapped players for picks such as Paul George and Kuzma, indicating that something was going to change with Magic City's direction. But in actuality, all the Mad Hatters did was trade away some good players and run it back with less talent. LeBron, Curry, and Jimmy are all still on the roster, and he didn't make any moves this offseason for younger pieces or any players at all. So with a lot less draft capital, less fantasy contributors, and his veterans getting another year older, Gian is currently stuck in limbo until he decides to completely retool the Mad Hatters. I definitely think blowing it up would be the wisest decision for Gian, since the way the roster was constructed when he joined the league basically put his window for winning on a time crunch, and that window is now boarded and sealed shut. There's really only 3 keepers I would give the official stamp of approval for, and that starts with SGA. Now that Giddey is out of town, there's a chance that Shea could elevate his playmaking and fantasy numbers to even greater heights. He's a top 10 asset in the DBL. But after him, things start to get a little murky. LeBron is still going to average over 30 fantasy points as he turns 40 this year, but the injury concerns and regression in general are still feasible worries. The biggest what if to me with Bron is when is he going to retire, because I certainly see a world where this is his second to last season. If that's the case, Gian needs to act fast or else his stock is going to plummet. I have hesitation with Gobert as well, because even though he reminded us all he's still a beast at 32 fantasy points last season, he's also the same age as that number and time is ticking on his playstyle as we see these types of centers fizzle out when they get older. I'm still predicting a year around 30 to 32 fantasy points, but injuries as well as adding another year to his age make me think Gian should really explore the trade market for him. Believe it or not though, I'd rather move forward with Gobert on my team than Curry, who only averaged 25 fantasy points in a year that saw a washed up Klay Thompson, a complete Andrew Wiggins regression, Draymond Green suspensions, and Chris Paul injuries throughout the entire campaign. He might have just had a down year himself a bit, but I don't really know if we're going to see him approach the 30-point plateau again. I'd expect something similar to last year, but even if it does raise, he's reaching the end of his career too. He should be for sale to every contender in the league. Jimmy is also about to turn 35 and had a ton of injuries per the norm for him, but even more worrisome is that he went from 30 fantasy points a game to 26. Was it a down year or just the beginning of what's to come with him? These are Gian's best keepers and they all display red flags outside of SGA. One keeper I actually like and could serve as the face of the Mad Hatters rebuild is Cam Thomas, who averaged 22 points, 3 rebounds, and 3 assists last season. He was crazy inconsistent as he would range from dropping 40 fantasy points to 3 fantasy points the next game, but now with Mikal Bridges gone, he's going to be firing 50 shots a night. I still don't think he's going to be a top-end keeper as I'm envisioning around 22 fantasy points after the 18 he put up last year. He can be super inefficient and inconsistent as I said, but he's going to have the ball in his hands the entire game, for better or for worse. I think he's going to put up like 26, 5, and 4. Now these final 2 selections are pretty bewildering choices as Gian elected to go with Russell Westbrook and Tyler Hero. It was debatable whether or not Westbrook really deserved to be kept last year, but I gave him and Gian both the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he could provide a consistent 22 a night to justify the keep, and with Gian being a first-time member, I didn't hate it. But the Brody averaged 16 fantasy points last season, so not only did the Mad Hatters elect to hold on to him all year, they went ahead and doubled down by keeping him again. Let's face reality at this point. Westbrook is washed and probably hasn't been a keeper in the DBL for the past 3 seasons. It's just gotten worse every year. Maybe the addition of James Harden severely impacted his fantasy value on the Clippers, and you could try to make an argument that he's on a new team with the Nuggets now, but that doesn't make things much better. I highly doubt he's going to be starting next to Jamal as he turns 36 in just a few weeks, and he's proven that he works better as a backup at this stage of his career. This reeks of Nugget fan bias / mainstream name appeal, but Westbrook just isn't the player we all grew up watching anymore. If he turns out to be anything over 20 fantasy points, I'd be shocked, but I still couldn't praise the Mad Hatters accurately as I feel like it would be a ginormous stroke of luck for him to be beneficial in fantasy this year. And as far as Hero, he's a broken record cliche at this point. Dude just can't get over the 21 fantasy point hump, can't stop battling injuries, and hasn't been worth a high draft pick the last 3 years, let alone a keeper spot. Even if the Mad Hatters wanted to rebuild, I can't get behind this as Hero has now had 5 seasons to give us something more. There's always the possibility that still happens, but at this point, he has to show it before we continue to believe it. He hasn't been a keeper in the DBL since the origination of keepers because the league needed to see it before gambling on him any further. It's still a much better decision than going with Westbrook, but I could probably list 10 to 12 guys I'd rather have over the both of them. All in all, I fear these are probably the worst keepers in the league. From an injury standpoint, from an age perspective, from a mix of established veterans to younger assets to neither, the current foundation of Magic City has a lot of question marks. This isn't a terrible gathering of keepers, but it's not a championship contender or even a postseason contestant anymore. Gian's first pick in the draft was Daniel Gafford, and while I do think he will be a solid addition to a fantasy team, there were like 4 other centers who provide the same production as him, except they're actually guaranteed minutes. Capella, Pirtle, Nurkic, and Zubac all put up the same range of fantasy points last year, except the difference is Gafford was doing that in significantly less playing time. That's impressive for his sake, like wow, just get this guy 30 minutes a game, but he's splitting time with Lively and may not be starting either. He can still put up 21 fantasy points in limited action, but those other guys will probably all be putting up 24 plus, and you don't have to be constantly frustrated that they're only playing 20 minutes a game. With back-to-back picks, however, Gian took the Boston backcourt of Jrue Holiday and Derek White. I feel like these were kind of steals at this spot, actually. They're not amazing, but they'll both average like 21 fantasy points and help Magic City either get some W's or future draft picks. In the 4th round, G rocked with Herbo Jones and Ayo Dosunmu. I kind of feel the same way about Herb that I do about Trey Murphy, like neither of them are a top 4 option, so unless Ingram or one of them is traded, their fantasy production isn't going to look too hot. I feel like Ayo could be a good player, but he's playing in a Chicago backcourt that has Josh Giddey, Kobe White, Zach LaVine, Lonzo Ball, Javon Carter, and the list goes on. Even if he beats out 2 of those guys for minutes, you're talking about a dude coming off the bench that won't be able to supply enough production to stay on a DBL roster. Overall, I don't hate this draft, but I wouldn't say I like it either. I think Gafford and the Celtics were solid picks, but they probably don't belong on a team that I've stated should be starting their rebuild. It's not exactly the same as the Nice because at least the Mad Hatters have legit all-DBL talent that could theoretically make a push for the playoffs, but it's still not a smart move when they couldn't do it last year with more firepower. There are bright spots on this ball club, but it needs work to be relevant, and with Magic City's minor draft capital, it really only makes sense to start over from scratch. I'd keep SGA and Cam Thomas and get rid of everyone else, or the Mad Hatters could be stuck in purgatory for years to come. Right below Magic City will be Alec with the Yellowstone Pronghorns. Alec had quite possibly the toughest challenge any member of the DBL had faced until the expansion teams arrived, where he had to take on what was essentially an expansion team in itself with only 3 weeks until the keeper deadline. Left with below average talent and a race against the clock, Alec did what he could all year, which didn't help much, resulting in only 3 wins. However, Yellowstone made some sneaky moves during the season, which may give him a fighter's chance to break into the playoffs in 2025. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, and there's still going to be some headaches along the way, but this young team is shaping up to be a squad worth watching. Alec pieced together a pretty competitive collective of players here. He doubled down on his best young keepers from last season while slowly acquiring more talent throughout the schedule. Halliburton is elite, and while he may have cooled off at 32 fantasy points, he cooled off at 32 fantasy points, which suggests there's a world where he can keep up a 36 fantasy point average clip. He'll need to stay on the court and get more consistent, but Halliburton was all DBL 3rd team for a reason. Next up, Jalen Duren was also a bright spot in a dark season for Yellowstone. Although he missed 20 games, he put up 28 fantasy points in his sophomore year at the age of 20. The sky is still the limit, and he is already one of the best big men to own in Dynasty. Alec's 3rd surefire star was also sensational last time out, as his 2nd Tyrese in Maxey shot up to stardom and averaged 26 fantasy points. There's a chance that Paul George's contributions could cause Maxey to have a slight downtick in usefulness, but he could also continue to rise through the ranks of the DBL and is a must-own for the rebuilding Pronghorns. One of 2 Grizzly keepers from Yellowstone is Desmond Bane, who pretty much met expectations last year with a 24 fantasy point average. It was actually 25 plus before his injury woes, and that was the story for all of Memphis, but is still a young enough SGSF who has gotten better every year. Spending a first rounder on the guy is pretty equal value for someone who can be a useful player for the foreseeable future. His co-star in Jaren Jackson Jr. I unfortunately don't have such kind words for. Look, Dez also struggles with injuries and needs to prove that with Ja back in the lineup he can continue to flourish to more elite heights, but Jaren showed us without both of them in the lineup and an entirely depleted roster that he could only muster up 23 fantasy points. While still a decent keeper at that stage who isn't even 25 by the way, I've been off the Trip bandwagon for years now. Yes, a season prior saw him average 26 fantasy points points and take home the DPOY, but he still can't rebound and clearly needs other star players to make an impact. 2 first-round picks in 2025 from 2 organizations that won a combined 4 games last season is alarming. He can still be a solid low-end keeper for several more years, but I don't think he's ever going to turn into the two-way superstar fantasy owners have been expecting the past couple of seasons. Another disappointment from last season comes Darius Garland, who only averaged 19 fantasy points and looked like a shell of himself. At least the Pronghorns didn't spend too much draft capital on him with a buy low move that could turn out to be very rewarding whether he's traded or just had a down year. As long as D-Mitch is there with the continued development of Mobley, Garland isn't averaging over 24 fantasy points and will likely only get back up to 22 or 23 this season, but that's still a solid enough keeper for Yellowstone, who didn't have many in that department a year ago. Scoot Henderson was pure garbage in his rookie debut, but there's still hope he can turn things around in 2025. There's a lot of guards and a generally unorganized plan in Portland, but he needs to shoot up to around 19 fantasy points this year for me to believe he's still got the potential to be great. It makes sense for Alec to try his hand at him again, but if I were him, I would have tried to test the trade market first. Lastly, we have Derek Lively, who definitely has a lot of upside. He was instrumental for the Mavericks and one of the better pickups of the season last year. He needs to prove he can stay healthier, and the split minutes between him and Gafford make it tough to believe he's going to make giant strides this campaign, but as a young center playing with Luka, he's got a chance to be special in the coming years. In summation, I actually don't really have a problem with any of these keepers. I don't like what Alec paid for JJJ, Garland needs to prove he's an all-star caliber piece again, Lively needs to prove he can stay healthy, and Scoot needs to prove anything, but they all fit nicely with Alec's timeline and deserve to be keepers, especially for a young and rebuilding team. It's the rare case where Alec has a youthful rebranding happening while simultaneously being competitive enough to win games and fight for the playoffs, which I like. As long as Alec doesn't try to go all in and screw up his rebuild, this is a well-rounded upcoming core for the Pronghorns. And while I wasn't overly high on his draft, I think Alec made some solid selections. With pick number 2, Alec went with the first overall pick in the NBA draft, Zachary Risacher. To be honest, I probably would have rather seen him go for an Alex Sarr or even an Ivica Zubac, but Risacher was the first overall pick, so it's hard to pass up on that. There's a chance he's great, and if it's not this year, it could still happen as a talented number 1 overall pick. But at the same time, nobody expected him to go number 1, and it doesn't seem like anyone has any faith in him to be much of a difference maker. It's going to be a wait-and-see situation like most rookies, but I can't really hate on this pick at all because it certainly fits the infrastructure of the Prongs. Staying with rooks, at number 7, Alec rolled with Rob Dillingham, and I think this is a pretty smart choice. I don't have a lot of stock in him being uber successful in year 1, but Mike Conley is getting old and probably won't be around much longer. At least not with the Timberwolves. Dillingham's likely going to be their starting point guard of the future, and I think he will be able to capitalize in the coming years. He may have a Keontae George type of debut season. At 17, Alec went with Tobias Harris, and again, I like this pick. Harris may not necessarily fit with the younger generation Yellowstone employs, but like I mentioned, this team has an outside shot of postseason contention. There's no harm in selecting some vets that can produce, because by the deadline, if the team doesn't have a good record, he can sell them to a contender. And I actually think Tobias might be one of the better win-now players from the draft. He's going to be the second option on a really bad Pistons team. If he averaged 22 fantasy points last year, there's no reason to think he can't at least replicate that, but I have him finishing at 23. Another second-round pick for Alec became Chris Middleton, and this is probably my least favorite pick. I've been continuing to support him for the past 2 years amidst disastrous results, but he just can't stay healthy, and even when he is actually playing, I'm not really getting that sense of all-star K-mid anymore. I don't hate it because this could be the year where he turns things around, but as someone that drafted him last year and thought it was a good low-risk, high-reward move, I've been burned too many times. Lastly, Yellowstone brought back Jaime Jaquez after some impressive games with the team last season. I don't really know what his role is though. Like, is he starting at PF or SF, or is he coming off the bench and playing limited minutes? I'm unsure, but he did flash a prowess that shows he could be hungry to get better. However, at the same time, with cats like Hero, Duncan, Rozier, and others of similar nature, I'm not that high on him this year. This really isn't that bad of a draft. I mean, I like how Alec intermingled young stars and guys like Risacher, Dillingham, and Jaquez with veterans such as Tobias and Middleton, but I'm just not sure how much any of those guys other than Harris are going to be immediate impact players. But these are the kinds of swings and selections Alec should be making, and I wouldn't be surprised if this actually wound up as a top 5 draft on the year. To conclude, Alec and the Pronghorns still have an uphill battle to climb. It's going to be hard to look me in the eyes and say he's better than the 7 teams ranked ahead of him, but you can make a valid argument he's at least going to be going toe to toe with a handful of them. I think we're probably still 2 years out from contender status, but the DBL is always unpredictable and anything can happen. I truly like where this core is heading, but it's going to take stability and composure from Yellowstone to not rush into anything too crazy. Some of these pieces still have a lot to prove, and although I'm higher on their draft than not, it could wind up being a total misfire that causes them to be far away from reaching the playoffs. When you remember they're in Group B with the likes of Peach Creek and Napa Valley, unfortunately I have to put them at number 8, but I wouldn't be shocked if they placed in 7th. Finishing as the final lottery team will be one of the league's most active and caring members in GM and as I have the New York Gems going 8-11 this year. After beginning with an 0-3 record last season, Ant wasted no time in blowing up his roster, sending franchise cornerstone Trae Young away for a giant haul of picks, which demonstrated to the DBL that this wasn't going to be some soft rebuild. Ant decided to fully commit to starting over, trading Jalen Brunson, Nick Claxton, JJJ, and Porzingis for young assets and draft compensation to further fuel his decision in resetting the Gems. I think this was a really smart move, as early on Ant recognized his team just wasn't good enough to compete with the multitude of stacked rosters in the DBL. This strategy landed him the first overall pick in the draft and some exciting acquisitions. He's clearly still rebuilding and doesn't plan on quote-unquote winning, so to speak, but he's got a much more balanced squad than the 5 teams ranked below him. I'm not in love with these keepers, but similar to the McLovins, when you're tanking, it makes a hell of a lot more sense to take on younger players and experiment with their outlook. I do think Josh did a better job at committing to that specific circumstance, although Ant undoubtedly has the stronger band of fantasy additions who are much more prepared to be deployed. Scotty Barnes is incredible, averaging nearly 31 fantasy points last season and showing the Toronto front office that they needed to immediately build around him. The hope is that he can take that production and carry it even further into 2025 with the possibility of averaging 34 fantasy points. Zion is an interesting case, as I kind of roasted New York for spending so much on such a concerning player, but Zion actually impressed his doubters by playing in 70 games last season. I still can't really trust that, as he's proven too many times that he's more likely to miss most of the schedule rather than play in most of it, but it's still an encouraging sign. As far as his play, he was kind of lukewarm for the first half of the campaign, but started to pick things up well enough to average 27 fantasy points. If you ask me, that's still not really remarkable enough for someone who was touted as a generational prospect, but 27 fantasy points is obviously no joke. I hope he can improve and stay healthy for most of the season, but I don't have much faith in that notion until he can continue to show me that he's capable of staying on the court and off of Pornhub. Zion's newest teammate in DeJounte Murray is Ant's next keeper, and the move to NOLA actually raises Murray's fantasy impact if you ask me. He should be the primary ball handler as opposed to the off-ball shooter in Atlanta, meaning a boatload more assists and double-doubles as well as just a more consistent and fitting role. There's still a chance he isn't significantly better, and he's not reverting back to his standalone San Antonio season of 35 fantasy points, but I do expect a ballpark estimate around 27 to 28 fantasy points, which is an ultra big jump from his Atlanta production. And when Ant received D. Murray in that Season 5 deadline trade, he also received P. Giddy, 2 guys he had no idea were going to be moved from their original teams at the time. I gotta applaud this, as Ant acted before the rest of the league could get their grubby little hands on either of these guys, because now they're both very desirable. Giddy's 3rd season in the NBA and DBL respectively were horrifying, as his counting stats and minutes declined from averaging 25 fantasy points in year 2 to 19 in year 3. There's a lot of reasons for that, but it doesn't matter because now he's in Chicago, where he'll hope to be the focal point of the offense and uncaged to play his game. I'm pretty concerned, though, to be honest, between the other guards that remain on the Bulls, such as Kobe White, Ayo Dosunmu, Zach LaVine, and most notably Lonzo Ball, but even more so on edge because he's now part of an awful organization that might decide to only give him 24 minutes a game. But we've seen what Giddy is capable of to the point he was actually practically an untouchable asset for me. And now that he's got his own team and doesn't have to be the secondary ball handler next to an all-NBA guard, there's a good chance he can shoot up to like 26 fantasy points a night as long as the Bulls don't mess this up and as long as he stays away from local Chicago high schools. And selected Jalen Johnson as a first-year keeper for an inexpensive price since the rest of the league's stupidity caused Cam to drop it down. The man averaged 26 fantasy points as a 22-year-old third option. Now DeJounte Murray's gone and his production should look to increase. I'm not yet convinced he's an all-star caliber player, like, more so an elite 3 and D role player, but it equated to great numbers in fantasy last year. For just a second and third, this is a fantastic move for the Gems, who will look to lock in another youthful keeper as part of their core moving forward. Another player with a first-time keeper appearance on any team is Mark Williams, who was really good last season for the 19 games he played in. Yeah, a nagging back injury that was originally given a 2 to 3 week timetable turned into him missing the entire year, which was a big cause for concern with fantasy managers. I believe part of that had to do with a terrible and tanking Hornets team, who were also without LaMelo Ball most of the year, but it's still shocking how much time he wound up missing. As long as he can actually suit up most of the season, Mark Williams is in line for like 26 plus fantasy points a night, which is fantastic for a third year player. So far, while I have some raised eyebrows due to medical conditions for some of these players, these are 5 really good keepers for not just any team, but a rebuilding franchise such as the Gems. These last two keepers, though, I'm having a tough time wrapping my head around. I mean, I understand the decision to roll with Keegan Murray, a guy that Ant has believed in since day one and showed improvement to the tune of 19 fantasy points last year, but with DeRozan landing in Sacramento, Keegers is officially the fourth option at best. It could be absolutely fine for real life scenarios, but in fantasy, his already wobbly numbers are sure to take a dip to at least 18 fantasy points. If he can still raise them higher, then okay, that'd be great considering he's still so young too, but I'm not really feeling like many other franchises have much interest in him until he's in a more fantasy-friendly environment. Lastly, Ant elected to roll with Mikal Bridges despite hesitancy from outside sources, including the DBL podcast. I can admire a guy sticking to his beliefs about a player, especially after trading away esteemed assets to obtain him, but that doesn't mean I agree with it. Look, a year ago, I would have wanted to trade for Mikal Bridges too. After a sizzling stretch with the Nets in 2023, we all thought he was going to put up like 25 fantasy points a night. But he didn't. He was bad. Like, so bad he averaged 19 fantasy points as the first option in Brooklyn. Why would he get any better now that he's like the third and sometimes fourth option on the Knicks? At best, his efficiency will increase, but between Brunson, Towns, OG, and Hart, I don't think he's going to be averaging 20 points, 4 rebounds, and 3 assists again, which was all he averaged when he finished with 19 fantasy points last season. Maybe the power of friendship chemistry will propel him to 22 fantasy points a night, but there's no longer a chance for him to reach elite stardom in the NBA. He's basically a glorified role player, and his stats will fluctuate night in and night out. I like him, I'm a Knicks fan, and he's going to be great for us, but at 28 years old now, he is who he is, and I wouldn't be surprised if he only averaged 18 fantasy points. Overall, this is a pretty solid class of keepers for New York with their youthful age and tantalizing upside, some of which we already know can and will perform. As a rebuilding group, they have themselves set up for the future, but between some major health concerns and a thumbs down for me and Mikal Bridges being kept, this core isn't as good as I think it can be, but I do think it's a mostly smart decision for the Gems to go in. I think their draft was okay. There's some stuff I like and some other stuff that just feels out of place, but there's no denying Zach Edey at number 1 overall was likely the unanimous decision from DBL members. It's crazy how like 4 months ago people were saying this guy couldn't play in the NBA, and now he's the favorite to win Rookie of the Year. He will probably provide the most impact from this rookie class for this season alone, as I'm gonna guess about 12 and 8 with 23 fantasy points to boot. From the first pick to the last pick in round number 1, Ant landed on Bub Carrington at number 12. With Brogdon sidelined, there's a chance he can now show what he's made of and flash some potential, but I am not assuming he's going to come in and immediately contribute to a fantasy team. Maybe I'll be proved wrong, but I would have rather seen a Keontae George, Ron Holland, or any useful veteran be picked instead of him. In the third round, Ant went with Dyson Daniels, and I like this pick. It's kind of based off of faith and hoping he either starts or gets a good amount of usage, but when given playtime, he fills up the stat sheet, and now that Murray is out of town, he could very likely be the starting 2 guard with Bogey continuing to be the 6th man. But to me, the opposite of this is Dante DiVincenzo. He'll be a great 6th man for the Wolves, but there hasn't been a relevant 6th man guard since like Lou Williams, and he only averaged 21 fantasy points in his heyday. So while Dante's a good player, the new situation is not going to change the fact that he's just not a fantasy contributor. Finally, we have Marvin Bagley, and it's just the same story with him every season. He puts up decently solid stats whenever he plays, but he's often hurt or doesn't get enough minutes to justify holding on to him. Yet somehow every year someone falls for him or takes the gamble, and yes, he was a 5th round pick, so like who really cares? But I don't know, there were still more sure things available like Colin Sexton or Bobby Portis. At the end of the day, this draft probably could have been better, but it's also kind of obvious that Ant walked away with the most valuable player available, which is usually the case for first overall picks. In total, I can't blame Ant or anyone for their actions considering this was all our first year with 2 new teams taking away 16 other players that would have normally been kept, but I don't think this draft is going to cut it if Ant wanted to make the playoffs. I don't think that should be his goal because he's still got at least another year of a rebuild left to truly make a difference, but if he nailed the draft, I could see a world in which he's playing important DBL basketball in March. There's still a shot, but it's very unlikely with some big name juggernauts that lie ahead. I really like a heavy dose of the keepers that New York finalized, but between Keegan and McHale, as well as a subpar draft in my eyes, the 2024-25 season won't see the Gems making it back to the playoffs. Being in Group C with the McLovins, Brawlers, and Nice, Ant should feast on a solid number of wins, and if all else fails, we know Ant is one of the more caring and harder working managers in the league. The third second-year GM is Mike with the Fighting Grapes, who I have finishing in 5th place. The Grapes showed they're a force to be reckoned with in just one season, depicting what a difference a manager makes, as Ish never finished with more than 11 wins. Meanwhile, Mike debuted with a 13-6 record, which was the second best record in the league last year. With a little more experience and understanding of how the DBL works, Mike will be looking to make some more noise this season with a second consecutive playoff appearance. With some more moves and attentive wire monitoring, the Grapes have a chance at making it to the second round and seriously contending, but as we all know, this is an ultra-competitive league with some intimidating foes in the way. Nikola Jokic, nuff said. Moving on to Lauri Markkanen, this is a guy I had worries about purely just because we've only seen him excel in one standalone season, but last year was still great at 28 fantasy points. However, he only played in 55 games, and that's a recurring theme with Lauri, unfortunately, pretty much only having one healthy campaign his entire career, which came in his rookie stint with the Bulls at 68 games. So it's kind of a fact at this point that he misses time. The Grapes have a pretty stacked core, so they should be okay unless other guys start missing time too. Fox was sensational again last year, putting up 27 fantasy points and displaying an all-around impressive game. I don't really have any flaws with him. He's never going to be an elite playmaker or ever really be considered for triple-double watch, but he puts up numbers efficiently and he's still young. He's one of the best Grapes in Napa Valley. Sliding on over to Julius Randle, he's a bit of a polarizing guy. He started the season last year in brutal fashion before turning it on and giving us the prototypical Randle campaign at 24 points, 9 rebounds, 5 assists, and 28 fantasy points. While he took a backseat to Brunson, it didn't show in the stats at all, but his sizzling season was hampered by a shoulder injury, which only saw him play in 46 games. Now he's on the Wolves and will pretty much slide right into the cat role with ease, at least when it comes to fantasy. He might struggle out of the gate adjusting to his new team, plus it's easy to foresee his rebounds taking a hit as he shares a front court with Gobert, but I don't think he's going to be much different from last year unless he really doesn't fit in. I'm going to guess around 27 fantasy points. Next up is Vucevic, and this guy just refuses to slow down, at least in the DBL. He once again averaged over 28 fantasy points, and now without DeRozan or possibly even Levine out of the Windy City, he could push that back up to over 30. The pessimistic side is that he himself is over 30, now 34 years old, so the clock is ticking. He's gonna be irrelevant soon. The Bulls might also choose to sit him if they don't trade him so they can deploy their youth, so it's just an interesting scenario to keep an eye on, but as for now, Vooch is still an elite fantasy player. The newest fighting grape would be Paul George, who Mike didn't give that much up for. A second, third, and a fourth is still an overpay in my approximation, but it could be the difference between making the finals or missing the playoffs entirely. You never know, so I applaud the move, although I have been a frequent naysayer of PG8 pretty much since the inception of the DBL. Not only is he also 34, so time is a factor with him, but he's known for missing a lot of games. He played in a shocking 74 games last season, but 4 years straight before that didn't see him past 56. He's also going to be the third option in Philly, which could theoretically see him average 24 or 23 fantasy points. Maybe it could stay at like 25, but with all those other reasons to consider, I'm even lower on Paul George's fantasy stock. A decent eighth keeper, but I'd still rather draft him at this point. Luckily for Mike, Jonas Valanciunas changed teams into the Wizards of all places, where he should hopefully feast on a garbage team. He could be in line for like 26 plus fantasy points, assuming he's given the workload. Otherwise, we might be looking at the 22 to 24 fantasy points over the past few years from limited runs. The final factor of the Grapes foundation is Franz Wagner, who Mike elected to keep for a second straight year. I get it, but I'm still lukewarm on him. After an impressive rookie year on a bad team, I've been waiting on a true breakout, and it hasn't really happened 2 seasons later. It very well could be this season. He's young and has swag to his game, all the while steadily improving his numbers and pretty much certifying himself as the second option to Paolo. Capella probably would have ensured a better immediate impact than Wagner will, but I wasn't very high on him either, and Franz hopefully still has more to unlock down the line. As your final keeper, I'm cool with this decision, but he may not do much more than 22 fantasy points a night. In the end, it can be argued that Mike has the best 8 keepers in the league. There's some injury concerns and regression candidates to keep an eye out for, but that's the case with just about every team in the DBL, so I gotta applaud this core for being a mixture of young promise and veteran experience that can surely compete against the best of the best. Mike's first pick in the draft saw Reed Sheppard off the board, and while he's being touted as one of the best players in the class, I can't say I'm exactly in love with this decision for the Grapes. Yes, we all want to nab a young player that develops into a keeper for us and can be a franchise piece for years to come, but there's no way Reed Sheppard is fantasy relevant this season, right? He's coming off the bench in H-Town, where you have a lot of guards and young projects that all want to get better and prove something. There's just not enough minutes to go around. I have no doubt he'll display the potential that saw him go number 3 overall, but I would have rather seen Mike go with a Yusuf Nurkic or a Vika Zubac, someone that will immediately help him in his pursuit of winning a title. Reed can always be shipped off, especially if he actually plays well enough to entice the rebuilding rosters around the association, but it's always difficult to hold on to someone averaging less than 16 fantasy points, especially if you're in the playoff race. Reed might be a stud in the future, but I'm not sure it was the right selection to go with at this time. It wasn't until the 4th round that Mike was back on the board and he chose Naz Reid. The reigning 6th man of the year is a skillful NBA player, but I'm still not convinced he's going to inflict much damage in the DBL. Towns may be gone, but he's still coming off the bench behind Randall, and even if he is utilized more, I don't think it'll be enough to surpass the 17.1 fantasy points he averaged last year. As a 4th round pick, there's not much left to work with, so if Reid averages 18, it could be a fine addition, but I feel like I'd rather go with a riskier choice than someone whose ceiling for the season is likely under 19 fantasy points. Napa Valley didn't receive most of their counterparts until the final round of the draft, where they took 3 players in Colin Sexton, PJ Washington, and Harrison Barnes. Sexton, to me, is Mike's best pick of the draft, depending on how you look at the circumstance with Reed Sheppard. I'm surprised Sexton fell so much. He averaged 19 fantasy points last year, and the last third of the season probably saw him average close to 23 fantasy points. While he's still a one-dimensional player that has other guards to compete with in Keontae George and Jordan Clarkson, for a 5th round pick, you can't really do much better. As for the others, though, I'll pass. Again, it's the 5th round, and you've got to decide which uneventful players left will do the most, but Barnes will probably shrink to even less production coming off the bench in San Antonio. PJ Washington will hit a lot of corner threes and be an important part of the Mavs' success, but he's not averaging more than the 16 fantasy points he put up last season. Overall, I feel like the Grapes would have benefited from trying to trade up in what's being called the worst DBL draft class of all time. 3 picks in the 5th round is a brutal way to fill out your roster, and when you go with a first-year player in Reed Sheppard that likely won't materialize for at least a few seasons, it's going to be hard to outduel the other competitors vying for the title. Don't get me wrong, there's still hope for Napa Valley. Mike's still finding his footing in this league and will get better and smarter as a manager every year. As long as you have Jokic on your team, you're always going to be in a good position. Plus, there's quite a number of other useful pieces that will assist the Grapes night in and night out. I don't think I can in good conscience label them as a top 3 team this year, but I wouldn't be surprised if they made noise either. In 5th, I've got the team that managed to fight their way all the way to a second finals berth in their franchise's history, and that would be the Las Vegas Whales. James stunned a lot of fans last year, as there was a lot of doubt on whether his team was too old and past their prime to truthfully contend, but alas, he was the Western Conference champion, so you've got to hand it to him. His plan from a season prior worked. Tank for the greatest prospect in the history of basketball and come back a year later to massive success. Although he didn't wind up winning, regardless of how you look at the situation, he still won. He's got Wemby for the rest of his life. If you average 35 fantasy points as a rookie who is only scratching the surface, your team will always be a threat. However, a lot of my concerns from a year ago are still prevalent because it's only a matter of time before most of the compartments of the Vegas core collapse. Wemby is obviously unmatched, but he's going to have to do a bulk of the workload to make this team, as it currently is, a top 2 seed in my eyes. That shouldn't be a problem for him, as I foresee his average possibly eclipsing 40 fantasy points this year. Bam is also one of the best players to own in the DBL, going for 31 fantasy points last year at still only 27 years old. Towns is in a new environment for the first time in his career, and I have to think this will impact him positively. Over the past couple of seasons, he took a major backseat in scoring and rebounding duties, with Ant-Man and Gobert being the primary contributors to those categories. He'll still be the second option in New York, but being reunited with Tibbs means familiarity on the court as well as an average of about 39 minutes per game. On top of that, he's back to the center position, with his front court mate being OG Anunoby. He should be close to 12 rebounds per game after dropping to 8 the past few years. But there's still some concern with his health, as it's almost guaranteed he'll miss a chunk of games at some point, and with Tibbs running him into the ground, it might not necessarily be the best thing ever. Still, this is a much better position for Towns to be in than in Minnesota, and as long as James is okay with him missing time throughout the year, this 3-headed monster of centers will be the focal point of the Whales offense. But then we start to get into a little bit of a pickle. Harden was once again a fantastic fantasy contributor last season at 27 fantasy points, but he was at 33 the year before, 35 the year before that, and 40 in season 2. That is an awful trajectory that will play into the success of the Whales, and I have to fully blame James for that, because you can clearly see the diminishing production year in and year out, and the front office seemed to stand idly by as a now 35-year-old James Harden prepares to suit up in a Vegas uniform once again. He averaged 16 points, 8 assists, and 5 rebounds with the Clippers, which is kind of a disgusting downtick. Now, let's look at the positives. He did that with a lower usage rate than we're used to from him, and now Paul George and Russell Westbrook are off the team. Let's not forget Kawhi will probably miss a lot of time too. So in theory, we could see Harden reach 32 plus fantasy points again, be at that 20 and 10 level he's been on since leaving the Rockets, and revert to the system the Whales will need him to be. Yet I still have little faith this is going to go very smoothly. Harden may look at the team he's on, especially if Kawhi is out of the lineup, and say, fuck this, I'm out, because we know it's very possible he goes down that path. Not only that, but like I said, he's approaching his late 30s. We already have factually seen regression every season. I just am not thrilled to have James Harden as my third or fourth best keeper. I think the Whales needed to move this man when he was arguably still on the Nets, but at least on the Sixers, and I could totally see a world he's super good in fantasy this year, but the amount of picks and value that Vegas has lost out on by squeezing every little drop out of James Harden is otherworldly. Anyway, there's also Lillard, who's kind of following suit. He was very underwhelming in his debut season on the Bucks, averaging just 26.3 fantasy points. That's only 0.01 fantasy points more than DeMar DeRozan, and I'm not using that as a knock on DeRozan, but Lillard has always been looked at as the more prestigious superstar in Delta Beta Lambda. But guess what? They're both the same age, and DeRozan is pretty much Mr. Consistency, whereas Dame has also shown a lot of signs of slowing down. I think he's still got one more great season in him, but I don't think he's going to be extremely relevant in fantasy much longer. I think he'll have a good year, probably better than last year, but that's still a worrisome situation the Whales have to monitor closely. These are all still great keepers thus far, but reduction with these star guards is palpable. The Whales made a good move at last year's trade deadline to beefing up their roster to try to win the chip, but it came at a price, an overpay for the return of Fred VanVleet. He averaged 25 fantasy points, which is tough to say is not worth the first, but with the Rockets' young core slowly taking over, I think he may eventually wither out in value. I suspect about 23 to 24 fantasy points this year, which is pretty close to last year's performance, but I'm also a little hesitant even though he proved me wrong. Everyone's still been pretty great up to this point, but these last two keepers I think are pretty foul, honestly. Zach LaVine has buried his value the past 2 to 3 seasons between injuries, trade talk, and inefficient production, resulting in only 20 fantasy points last season. While I do expect a revival in some way, I don't think that means anything over 23 fantasy points. That's a good number for your 7th keeper, but that's no guarantee in Chicago where he may not play until he gets traded elsewhere, or if you can even count on him to suit up and not be hurt. There were a handful of free agents who would have been better choices. LaVine is capable of being a solid 2nd-string fantasy player again, but why take that risk with other options available for pretty cheap, including some that were on the Whales that maybe could have been kept over him. I understand James spent some picks to receive Zach, but when you make a mistake, sometimes you just have to accept it. Lastly comes MPJ, and while he averaged 21 fantasy points in a bounce back from 18 the year before that, 21 is still pretty horrible for a guy that Vegas has been keeping since our first ever season keeping came into play. There was a point he looked very promising, but that ship has now sailed, my friend. Can he still muster up 22 to 23 fantasy points this year? It's certainly doable, but that would still be pretty risky since nothing over the past 3 seasons suggests it'll happen. I think what's more likely is him slipping under 20 again, so why take this leap of faith in Porter when there was once more other options available who will objectively be better? Unfortunately, not a fan. At the end of the day, this is still a pretty sleek battalion of players, but it could have been a lot better if James actively tried to maximize the potential of Wemby by supporting him and Bam with stronger and more reliable fantasy choices. Instead, he settled for a bland option in LaVine and the head-scratching staple of MPJ, but hey, at least Collins was finally abandoned. This group will still eat in a lot of matchups, but I expect slippage for a handful of these guys. James' draft isn't really helping his cause either, though. The Whales didn't have a pick until number 35, and that was Bogdan Bogdanovic, a 32-year-old sixth man who's never excelled in the DBL. To make matters worse, Vegas only had 3 picks in the actual draft, next selecting Dennis Schroeder at 38. I guess that helped him win Best Draft last year, but this is a guy that's constantly getting traded and never has a consistent role. Someone's got to produce in Brooklyn, but he's probably like 3rd or 4th in the pecking order. At 59, James took Norm Powell, and this is probably my favorite pick of his. I don't have much much faith in him to average over 18 fantasy points, but with Paul George gone, another wing/guard spot opens up, and maybe he can increase his volume in that regard, but I wouldn't be surprised if he only averaged 15 to 16 fantasy points. As the only selecting team in the follow-up draft, the Whales 2 years in a row take Bilal Coulibaly. He might have potential, but he's got a lot of room to grow, and I just don't know if I see that happening on the Washington Wizards, a team that, correct me if I'm wrong, hasn't drafted a star since Bradley Beal in 2012. He's only a second-year player, and the literal draft was already completed, so it's a whatever flyer. Lastly comes Jalen Smith, and if Vucevic misses a bulk of time or is traded, this will be a great move, but if not, it's a bad one. Yeah, again, there's no one to really choose from at this point, but this will most likely end up as a complete waste. Overall, it's tough to count out James and the Whales since they've only ever had one bad season, and that was the year they decided to purposefully tank. They finished as the Western Conference champs last year, tied for the best record in the league, became one of only 2 franchises in the DBL to reach a second finals, and have the future GOAT in Wemby at only 20 years old. It may be considered a bit disrespectful to drop the Whales down to 5th, but I just feel like there's 4 better teams this season, and their draft was not good enough to sustain a top 3 finish. With a couple of trades and consistent wire management, James could honestly be the best team in the league, especially if Harden, Lillard, and LaVine have bounce back years. But the Vegas track record kind of shows there won't be many trades to make this a better team, and I think that might actually be for the best this year. Be a seller instead of a buyer. Get stuff back for Harden and Lillard while you still can. If LaVine plays well, trade him as soon as possible. Entertain offers for Towns if the right price is there. As long as you have Wemby and Bam as the second option, this will be a playoff team, but do you want to be an Indiana Pacers every year or a Boston Celtics? Again, James could go out there and win a ring this season alone, and I could have been way off about my prediction for 5th, but I know I'm not wrong about the future of this club if guys like Harden, Lillard, and MPJ are all still on the team by year's end. I don't expect a singular person from his draft to be on the roster by January, and when you realize they're playing in Group A with the Stars, Tropics, and Knights, all of whom I haven't even talked about yet, I think I'm comfortable with my projection. Just outside the top 3 at number 4, I've got GM Gary with the Los Angeles Stars. The Stars have put together an impressive outing after beginning in their foray into the league with a 2-34 record through 2 years. The next 2 years saw them go 26-12 and drastically improve as a ball club. Last season probably only saw them lose 7 games because of the injuries to Joel Embiid and other major players in the supporting cast, but they still bowed out with a first-round exit. LA should once again come close to sniffing out a championship, but it's going to require even more dedication and elite management, which we can expect out of the Stars, but can be tricky with so many other competitive teams trying to win it all. Embiid is undoubtedly one of the best players in fantasy, and his headaches may actually be one of the few people that are worth having them for. Yeah, he'll probably miss a lot of games, as he kind of alluded to by saying he doesn't care about the regular season anymore and just wants to be healthy for the playoffs, but he's so good it almost doesn't matter. I mean, it still does, but when you come close to averaging 50 fantasy points, it can be forgiven. As for D-Book, he had the best campaign in his DBL career, averaging 29.6 fantasy points. This is probably his ceiling at this point, but a guy that can net nearly 30 a game is still one of the best players in all of the league. Last season, Brunson had a career year with 28 fantasy points. After doubting him 2 years in a row, I really don't think he can excel further, but he should put up a relatively similar season even if he drops to around 26 fantasy points. He's absolutely a greater star than I ever anticipated though, and it's still possible for him to reach 30 fantasy points per game. Unfortunately, I will always kind of be pessimistic with Kawhi. He did play in 68 games last year, which is the most we've seen since 2017, but that's more of an outlier than a suggestion that he's going to be healthier these days, especially as he reaches his mid-30s. Fantastic player when on the court, but I still wouldn't necessarily want him because of all of his health concerns. He might turn up his production with PG gone, but I still don't trust him enough to care. Jaylen Brown just won the NBA Finals MVP, but he also dropped 3 fantasy points to 24. It's possible he picks that back up again, but being on the Celtics with all their key guys, I assume he'll stay around that mark, maybe 25 fantasy points, which isn't amazing, but still a great addition, especially for an SGSF that's still in his 20s. The other Celtic the Stars obtain as a first-time keeper for their franchise is Kristaps Porzingis. Lethal fantasy player when healthy, but he's in line to miss at least 20 games a year. We saw how banged up he was last season, and I think it'll only make matters worse with the Celtics wanting to rest him to make sure he's available for the postseason. Next comes Jamal Murray, who finally took a step in the right direction, averaging over 25 fantasy points. He also typically misses some time now, playing in only 59 games last year, so he's also poised to be out of the lineup here and there. I don't know if he can continue to push his fantasy average higher, but if he can stay at 24 or 25, that's a commendable amount for someone who used to struggle getting over 21. Gary's final keeper brings us Miles Turner, and while an above-average 8th member of a team, I still think he could have done better. Turner's fine, like I said, a supplemental piece to a core, but I feel as if there were better options available, although I understand not needing to make a move when the guy already averages over 23 fantasy points. He's 28, so he still has some fruitful endeavors ahead of him, but I think that one All-Star selection at 27 fantasy points was an anomaly. He also needs to be monitored in the injury department, even if he played in an incredible 77 games last year. He hasn't played in 70 plus since 2019. All in all, you could say I'm nitpicking and trying to find holes in the Stars keepers, and that's pretty accurate. This is probably a top 3 core in the league, maybe 4 when you do consider the staggering amount of injury problems in here, from Embiid to Kawhi to Porzingis to Jamal to Turner. It's certainly a dangerous game to play, but a game worth playing when the talent available should be good enough to allow LA to coast for most of the season. But I'm not a fan of their draft. Gary's first pick at number 18 was Kel'el Ware, and while he has some tantalizing potential, is Gary betting on Bam Adebayo being ruled out the entire year? I realize you shouldn't always draft with a win-now approach, because if you think a guy is going to be good in the future, you select him and then enjoy his stat lines for years to come. But it's not easy to win a ring in this league, and as someone that's won 3 of them, I mean that. Ware is not going to get enough run to justify a roster spot on an LA team that's gunning for a chip. If he's not able to trade him to a McLovins or Brawlers or other lottery team, he's going to be dropped for nothing, and that 18th pick was only the mid-second round where Gary could have used some more ammo. If he's that passionate about the guy, the Stars can ride the wave and hope for the best, and sometimes the best comes knocking early, but when you're trying to win, a guy like that is just getting in the way. A few spots later, Gary snags John Collins, and this is more like it to me. He put up 22.7 fantasy points last year, and will hover around a similar-ish mark again. I'm going to guess 21 for Collins and about 14 for Ware. Another risk was taken when the Stars took on Lonzo Ball. I'm not about it. Let's pretend he didn't just miss 2.5 years of basketball. Let's pretend he isn't surrounded by a team full of guards in Zach LaVine, Josh Giddey, Ayo Dosunmu, Kobe White, Javon Carter, Chris Duarte, Talen Horton-Tucker, and Dalen Terry. Now, let's pretend he was ever actually a great fantasy player. That part's hard for me to envision. Maybe my mind's a little foggy because it's been so long, but I seem to remember him being a 20 to 21 fantasy point guy. Maybe that's not bad at all for a third-round pick in the first ever 12-team draft, but when you take into account those other issues, I see him as a non-factor. Back in the fourth, we got Cam Johnson and Malcolm Brogdon. Johnson will probably get a decent clip of shots, but he averaged 15 fantasy points last year, so I feel like the best case scenario is 18. The Nets are going to be bad, so I think everyone's going to be inconsistent in fantasy if you're not Cam Thomas or Nick Claxton, and honestly, even them. Brogdon wasn't a terrible choice because the Wizards suck, and he was obviously a strong option when he was a Pacer, but he's always injured, and that is already the case as he'll miss a month of the season to start. But LA still had another pick, and they went with Draymond, which is probably a top 2 or 3 pick on their board. Dre was annoying as fuck last year, but still averaged 21 fantasy points. If he doesn't try to kill someone on the court, it should be around the same level still, which is an absolute steal for the 48th pick. I guess in the end, this draft really wasn't so bad, but the Stars still have to land a harder blow if they want to have a roster complete enough to win it all. Ware could be beneficial down the line, but not this year. Brogdon's too hurt and inconsistent to do anything meaningful. Cam Johnson could improve, but not to the point he's going to need to be in the lineup, and Lonzo Ball has way too many concerns to seriously approve of. It comes down to John Collins and Draymond Green, who are not sexy names but will be satisfactory employees of the Stars. This could have been better, but if you hit on at least 2 draft picks, the management can make it work throughout the year. I need to see some more trades and elite pickups to push the Stars over the edge, but we all know it's a possibility. These keepers are phenomenal, and LA was in the finals 2 years ago. But with so many good teams trying to win it all and a plethora of injury-riddled guys, I had to pump the brakes a bit and settle for a 4th place finish. With 9 teams already locked in, that leaves 3 Eastern Conference cavalcades left, and in 3rd place look no further than the Peach Creek Oof Magoos. For 2 straight years now, the Magoos have managed their team very well and made it as far as the semifinals last season. Their core is an extremely strong and fearsome bunch, but my biggest concern is once again the injury probability of this group. Anthony Davis played over 70 games last year. Is that really going to happen 2 years in a row? Same with KD, Kyrie having a relatively smooth campaign, LaMelo continuously being hampered by illnesses of some sort. There's a lot of cause for concern. Peach Creek didn't switch up the formula, so it's hard to envision them holding the crown, but at the same time, it's not like they necessarily had to. This is an amazing assortment of talent, and their championship window is now, so there really isn't much to change. If these guys stay healthy, we could be looking at your newest championship team. There's nothing to say about NBA champion Jason Tatum at this point. He's going to average over 30 fantasy points, and he's still only in his mid-20s. He's the current face of the Magoos. AD averaged a whopping 42 fantasy points last year, as it's clear how valuable he is when he's able to suit up. 73 games last season is miraculous, but as I said, I don't have much faith in him replicating that. If he can, he'd be a top 5 player in the DBL unquestionably. Durant also matched him with over 70 games, but as we've seen since KD's return from the Achilles tear in 2019, he's missed large chunks of the schedule every season. He's also another year older now at 36, and while I still expect him to be an elite keeper, I can see him slipping to almost under 30 fantasy points. LaMelo is a frustrating player to address because he's got all the tools in the world to be a top 10 DBL player and hopefully the future and present of the Magoo's organization, but he has been ransacked by injuries in 3 out of 4 seasons, with the last 2 resulting in 58 games total. That's pretty nerve-wracking. I'm not sure LaMelo will ever fully get over the injury bug, which puts Gio in a tough spot because he obviously doesn't want to trade him, but he might have to if LaMelo can't stay on the court, at which point his value would be wildly lower than it deserves to be. That's like a worst-case scenario, but if LaMelo can play at least 60 games this season, I'd expect over 30 fantasy points. Shifting to DeAndre Ayton, I'm also confused about him because he was like kind of atrocious through the first half of last season, where his expectations were high too, since he was likely to be the first option in a new environment on the Blazers. But the stories about him being a lazy athlete and not caring that much seem to be true, as he barely averaged 24 fantasy points. But then something clicked and he finished the season with over 28 fantasy points. Can he finally turn that back up to another level? It's tough to say. He's pretty much hovered around this mark his whole career, which is amazing, but I also have a bad feeling he'll continue to be hot and cold throughout his entire tenure in the NBA. Kyrie's next, and you know what it is at this point. Last year was like the best case scenario for Irving at this stage in his career, where he played nearly 60 games and averaged 28 fantasy points. If he can go another year without drama, then this is likely all you can ask for. We want to see him play more of the schedule, but it's just not very likely. If he can still get you 27 plus any given night, it's a pretty fantastic 6th keeper. Gio also added Cade Cunningham at the deadline last season, and for the price, it was a pretty good pickup. I'm still wary he might not be turning into the all-around star that he's been teased to be, but with 24 fantasy points to his name in year 3, he's still super young and full of potential. Playing in Detroit and being as injury-prone as he's been, though, are worth being nervous about, but Cade still has a promising future and can hopefully develop more under Peach Creek management. Lastly comes RJ Barrett for like the 4th straight year, so you'd think he was in the upper echelon of Gio's keepers, but once again he finds himself at the bottom of the list. Yes, he seemed to turn things around in Toronto where he finally looked like a reliable fantasy option, but the fact of the matter is he still only finished the year with 20 fantasy points, which would be a career high. Yeah, the first half of the season is probably what brings that down, since he was yet again averaging 16 fantasy points with the Knicks, but I need to see a full year on the Raptors before I can actually lock Barrett in as a good keeper, since it's been like 5 years straight of him being an underwhelming player. We saw how Mikal teased us in Brooklyn only to wind up with an unflattering campaign. If everything goes right, he could average 23 to 24 fantasy points, but I'm still thinking he may hover around 20 to 21. Overall, this may be Gio's most polished crop of keepers yet, but with uncertainty surrounding RJ Barrett and an unprecedented amount of injury-riddled stars, there's still a ton of hesitation garnered when it comes to succeeding in the ultimate goal. As far as his draft, this is the best all-around board Gio has ever had and probably a top 3 to 4 draft in the entire league this year. As a manager, Gio has continuously improved and progressed every season, and now with a more than solid draft, he has become one of the most complete GMs in the DBL. Although I'm not absolutely in love with his first pick being Matas Buzelis, I do think he has the capability of joining an all-rookie team this season, whether that's first or second honors. That doesn't mean he's going to translate to fantasy right away or at all this upcoming year, and that's where the issue lies. Gio could have drafted someone more ready to help his team compete and win the title instead of a rookie that could be good and probably won't be very effective this season. But I do believe he can be a stud and eventually wind up starting over Patrick Williams or at the 3 before the end of the year. That being said, when you're this close to having a perfect team, you're better off with a reliable option than a kid who will probably average 14 fantasy points through the first 3 months of the campaign. But only 5 slots later, Gio was able to grab Clint Capella, and I really don't understand how he fell to number 16. I understand that he's not the DBL All-Star that once averaged 33 fantasy points, and that we've been worried about an incongru takeover for the past 3 seasons, but it still hasn't happened, and as long as Capella is getting like 26 minutes a game, then he's in line for the 24 to 25 fantasy points we've come to expect. I get that a lot of people want to go for potential with rookies, and a lot of franchises are rebuilding and want that young talent, but we all just let one of the best teams in the league get one of the best fantasy players available. At 22, I've never been in love with D'Angelo Russell, but in a draft following the expansion team collaboration, there isn't many other players that rank higher than him at the end of the second round. He averaged 21 fantasy points last year, and I'm expecting virtually identical statistics as the 3rd or 4th option on the Lakers yet again. The beginning of the third round saw Gio nab Josh Hart, and sometimes he can be a bit inconsistent. However, with DiVincenzo gone, he's going to get even more minutes to do the things that he does. He only averaged 20 fantasy points last year, which showcases the kind of slow beginning he had, but those last 2 months of the season saw him on triple-double watch every game. He contributes in every stat category, and even if he's the fifth option in New York's starting five, we could see him average 10 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, and a couple of steals to the tune of like 23 fantasy points. He can stay at that same 19 to 20 fantasy point level though, and that's still not the worst pick at all for the third round, but I do think he'll actually increase his average and help the Magoos considerably. Right after, Gio took Jeremy Sochan, and he's a third-year player, so we could see more improvement out of him, but I'm also a bit lukewarm too. The potential is there, but offensively we haven't seen much, so he needs to add a bit more to his game. I could see him averaging like 12, 7, and 4, but I could also see him averaging the same 16 fantasy points he did last year. It's not a bad pick for a flyer towards the end of the draft though. Lastly saw Peach Creek scoop up Mitchell Robinson with their 6th selection. He immediately went into the IR because he won't be playing until 2025. Now that we have 3 IR spots though, it might not be that bad to hold on to him, but I also don't really think it's worth it. Like, he's going to come back and probably average 15 fantasy points because he's a backup now. He was only averaging 20 as a starter, and he's always so unhealthy that it's not going to make a difference. This is my least favorite pick of Gio's, and I'd advise him to drop him if he racks up injuries. That's really the only pick I don't like though, and it was an extra pick at number 57. Zealous was probably too much of a stretch for being so close to a title-winning team, but I also think he'll be a top 5 or 6 rookie and could be even better moving forward. Capella and Hart were awesome ways to round out the bench unit. D'Lo is a more than justifiable end-of-roster guy, and Sochan has the ability to progress and make sense at the place he was taken in the draft. All in all, this is a draft in the running for the best of the year. It has everything: a rookie with upside and a chance to earn big minutes, actual fantasy veterans that could average 24 plus fantasy points, a project in Sochan that could pay off, and a big man in Robinson to stash in case Towns gets hurt himself. Sochan could easily suck, Bazelis could be irrelevant, D'Lo could get traded, and Capella could finally lose the bulk of his minutes, but as of now, this is a pretty stellar draft in my opinion. In the end, I think the Magoos draft really helps put them over the top. Before we filled out our teams, I had Gio sitting at 5th, which goes to show how close it is between so many teams, and also how important it is to nail your selections. I mean, you can always screw the draft up and still go on to clean up those mistakes, but it takes a lot of work and proper management. While trades, pickups, and overall keen GMing still have to be apparent in order for Peach Creek to win, allowing themselves more room and time with a good draft definitely helps the pressure subside. But I still have a lot of angst and uneasy feelings when it comes to their general core. Kevin Durant, Anthony Davis, LaMelo Ball, Kyrie Irving, Cade Cunningham, and DeAndre Ayton are all known for missing a lot of time. Gio's draft can keep him afloat if he's got a ton of IR spots taken up, but it also won't make the Magoos the terrifying threat they can be if everyone's hurt. And you can say that about a lot of teams, but this specific team has a lot of question marks in that area. However, they're playing in a group with a couple of teams they're much better than as well, which should help them get some more wins. If they can make it work, clearly I think they'll be really good in eyeing the top prize as the 3rd ever league champion. At this point, you might hate the Knights and their fan base, but you absolutely have to respect them. There is no argument against NJ anymore, if there ever even was. The Knights have now three-peated, which is something only the greatest franchises of all time have ever done. This is the Dynasty Basketball League, and they are truly a dynasty team. So why would I have them finishing in 2nd when they haven't finished in anything less than 1st since 2021? It's not because they're bad or anything, far from it, but eventually a team kind of runs out of luck despite how dominant they've been. Four-peating is on the table, but that's still going to be a crazy challenge because we all know how hard it is to win just one championship. If any team or manager could pull it off though, it'd be the Knights, but there's a lot of promising rosters heading into 2025. Much like Jokic, it's kind of enough said with Luka. At only 25, there's still a chance he can take his game to even greater heights. Sabonis is also a top 5 DBL player that averaged 42 fantasy points last year. I expect him to hover around that same mark. Moving on to Ja Morant is where things start to get interesting though. Ja's last 3 seasons saw him average upward of 29 fantasy points, but we all know the issues lie within availability, whether for health reasons or stupidity concerns. Hopefully, Ja has learned from his lengthy suspension, but he only played in 9 games last season following shoulder surgery, so his injuries also play a massive part in his value. Did you know he missed the DBL playoffs for all of the Knights championships? He was a huge reason we wound up in the playoffs to begin with, but being absent for 3 straight postseason runs is inexcusable. I'm hopeful for an MVP caliber season from Ja, and if NJ can get that, there's no telling what they're capable of since we won last year without him. If he plays in most of his games, we're looking at 30 plus FPs. I believe a huge comeback season is in effect as he enters the year with a chip on his shoulder. NJ's newest keeper is that of Donovan Mitchell, one of the best shooting guards in the league. Although he was still a star in Utah, that really didn't translate to fantasy until Cleveland, with last year's effort culminating in practically 30 fantasy points. I expect no different, as Spite has been able to do this with a stacked cast of DBL performers such as Allen, Mobley, and Garland. The only downfall is that he was a bit banged up last year and cooled off due to being in and out of the lineup by season's end, but he's still a premier name in Delta Beta Lambda. Speaking of Allen, Spite's sidekick will find himself in a Knights jersey for the fourth straight season. After a bit of an abysmal start to last year's campaign, the Fro went red hot the rest of the way and finished with his second season over 30 fantasy points. The four of those core guys, though, in Cleveland still make it a bit scary that he could take a dip, but he should be able to retain 28 plus fantasy points, and hopefully he won't be snubbed of another DBL All-Star selection. The next big man making his first time selection as a Knights keeper is Nick Claxton. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little nervous about Clax because 2 seasons ago he averaged 28 fantasy points and this past year saw him with a downtick at 26. That could be for a number of reasons. The Nets were pretty shitty and him and others such as Mikal Bridges struggled in the offense. Maybe he had just a bit of a down year, maybe he's just not that great. Don't get me wrong, 26 is still rather awesome, but I expected him to be at around 30 last year and maybe it was just more frustrating for me because I traded for him when he was actually at 28 and dropped a whole 2 fantasy points in just the brief amount of time I had him. He just got paid though, so hopefully he's energized to progress because he still has the chance to be a Gobert level type of fantasy and NBA player. If he stays at 26 though, that's still a damn good keeper for someone who's only 25. The last 2 keepers of NJ are Knights staples, Pascal Siakam and DeMar DeRozan. Both showed signs of slowing down last year, but after rough starts reverted to their usual selves. Siakam averaged 21, 7, and 4, which was a bit lower than the 24, 8, and 6 from a season prior. He's no longer the first option or the main catalyst of offense and playmaking as he was in Toronto the past few years, but I still think he could improve on what he did in Indy in 2024. He was probably still getting acclimated with his new team, so with an actual training camp, preseason, and more chemistry under his belt, Scal could get back to 28 fantasy points or so. I'm not expecting him to be on triple-double watch every other night again, but I think he'll have a more refined game than last season. As for Debo, the 4-time champ is a DBL legend. His move to the Kings could certainly throw a wrench in his production, but am I crazy to think he's still going to be very effective? There's a lot going against him. He's 35, he's the 3rd option on the Kings, and he's been good for so long that he's bound to fall off sooner than later. But that's just it. He's never had a bad season, he's always healthy, and he continues to prove us all wrong every year. We thought he was going to dramatically decline on the Bulls, and what happened? He became the first option and had the best run of his career. There's a chance that he actually becomes the first option in Sacramento. I don't believe it, but that's also what happened in Chicago. Their offense is just so high-powered, though, that he could still be putting up pretty elite numbers. I'm going to guess around 24 to 25 fantasy points, which I'd be more than happy with for my final keeper. At the end of the day, though, there really isn't anything you could say against this core. Are guys like Siakam and DeRozan past their prime? Probably. But they're still contributing at a high level, and other than a few injury discrepancies, the rest of these Knights are not going anywhere, as they've proven to be a lethal group together for the past 4 seasons. It's hard to argue that these aren't the best keepers in the league after coming off 3 straight championships. As for the draft, I think it was a solid effort. Every year we all think our own drafts are pretty good until they're not, but this isn't like last year where I thought it was the best draft ever only to be immediately humbled. It's not a perfect draft by any means. A lot of these picks have the potential of completely flopping, but I kind of don't give a damn to be honest with you. With the 3rd overall pick in the 2024 draft, the Knights took a bit of a risk by selecting Brandon Podziemski. We landed on him over one of the many centers and well-known fantasy contributors. We chose him over 2nd overall pick Alex Sarr, over a guy with shot-blocking force like Donovan Clingan, and so on and so forth. It might have been a little high, but for starters, this draft class sucked. 2, I couldn't get anyone to trade for the pick. Gary. And 3rd, and this may sound a bit hypocritical and cocky, but I have won 3 championships and am favored in a lot of sportsbooks to do it again. I don't mind taking such a big swing at this point. What do I have to lose? I've done all there is to do in this league and then some. Pods could be a misfire this year and may never be good, but it's not really a problem for me. I've clawed my way back from bad drafts before, I've made the right moves, and I've figured it out to ultimately go all the way. It ain't no sweat off my dick to mess this up anymore. Pods intrigues me. He made the All-Rookie First Team and put up 9 points, 6 rebounds, and 3 assists in just 26 minutes. He only averaged 15 fantasy points, but we saw him flash a, let's face it, Josh Giddey type of fantasy game. With Klay Thompson gone and Lauri Markkanen deals being turned away because the Dubs refused to give up Podziemski, I am totally drinking the Kool-Aid on this guy right now. I may feel differently in 3 weeks, but he should be getting at least 29 minutes a game and improving those stats to about 14 points, 7 rebounds, and 5 assists. Yes, I could say the same shit to myself that I've critiqued others for. You're a contender. matter? Why go for such a massive risk when there were guaranteed championship extensions left on the board? But I don't care. It's time to switch it up a little bit and try something new. He could be off my team in a month, but he could also be a keeper by the end of the season if he averages the 22 to 23 fantasy points I'm hoping for. At 13, I took Jakob Poeltl, and I don't understand why the likes of him, Zubac, Capella, and Nurkic were all an option for me at this point. I already had 3 centers, so I could only take 1 the entire draft, which also plays into why I took Pods, because honestly, if I had 2 entering the draft, then I would have taken 1 at both 3 and 13. But that wasn't the situation, so I took Pods because I thought he'd be gone by 13, and I'd select whatever center was still left in the second round. I didn't realize it'd be all of the good ones. I think maybe I fucked it up a smidge. Zubac is probably going to be the best of all of them this season, but you can't really go wrong with Poeltl either. The Raptors don't really have another center, and he's going to average his prototypical 11, 8, and 2 blocks a game, good for 23 to 24 fantasy points. I know everybody is rookie hungry, but you can't let the Knights get a former DBL All-Star that hasn't really lost a step. I didn't select again till 32, and I went with another risky decision in Chris Paul. The 39-year-old has burned me before when he dropped off humongously in an injury-riddled final stint with the Suns. He also kind of sucked last year, so why the hell would I pick him? Well, he's slated to start again on a pretty bad team where he'll be mentoring Wemby and throwing him the ball every possession for a boatload of assists. Think about it, CP3 averaged 7 assists last year in a backup role behind the greatest point guard of all time. Why can't he average almost 9 assists this year when he's playing with someone as dominant as Wemby and will be back in the starting 5? Yes, he may miss a lot of time and sit out a lot. Yes, he's going to average not 29 fantasy points again. Yes, he'll be 40 in May, but I think it's very possible he averages close to 24 fantasy points this year. If he doesn't, fuck me, whatever, but it can't be worse than the 17 he averaged on the Warriors. No 39-year-old has a bounce-back season, but he should be rather helpful in fantasy. My least favorite pick of my own was Andrew Nembhard. I don't dislike the pick, I think it's a solid investment at number 36, but he probably has the best chance of staying stagnant out of all of my selections. Nemby averaged 12 fantasy points last season in only 24 minutes. He had a bit of a coming out party in the playoffs where he scorched his opponents and cemented himself as the starting shooting guard next to Hallie for the upcoming year, but that could have just been a hot couple of weeks. He will improve his fantasy average, but it might only go up to like 16. At best, he'd be the third option on the team, which usually doesn't mean bulky production when you're a guard. But still, he could be a sneaky candidate for MIP with the hopes of averaging 19 points, 5 assists, and 4 rebounds at 21 fantasy points. Lastly, I got a bit of a steal in my approximation with Terry Rozier at number 39. He was insane with the Hornets last year, averaging nearly 25 fantasy points, but once traded to the Heat saw him at about 17 fantasy points. I think he'll meet somewhere in the middle of that this year. I'm not delusional, he's not replicating any of the Hornets' success, but a lot of Heat players get banged up, which will force him to be more involved. I'm going to guess 20 to 21 fantasy points for him, but if he sucks, I don't think it's a bad call to take him at such a deep spot in the draft. To sum it up, there's a couple of instantly better drafts that happen this go-round, but I think NJ's board features a good blend of upside and dependability. I don't think any selection here was bad. Maybe there could have been better choices, but I stand by this. I think it's a dark horse for best draft, but maybe that's just the instinctual bias talking that we all have for our own picks. Like I said though, it doesn't really matter. The Knights will find a way to dominate you. You can't outrun them, you can't hide, and you can't let a few draft day misses make you think their whole year is compromised. There may be some keepers to worry about like Ja Morant missing time or DeMar DeRozan losing touches, but we know Jersey's going to find a way to add talent to their team, whether through trades or pickups or whatever. If a dynasty like the Knights can manage to have a solid draft in the way that they did too, then it's hard to place them anywhere less than second, which would be disrespectful anyway considering their resume and track record. I want to put them first again because, well, it's my fucking team obviously, I want them first, but between the almost unbelievable impossibility of four-peating, being in the toughest group tier, and the hungry young organization I have ranked ahead of them, second place seems like a trustworthy bet. In back-to-back years now, I have to choose the Tropics yet again as the team to come in first place and win a championship. This team is so fucking good already, and other than Giannis, who's a top 3 DBL player, none of Cam's core have reached their ceiling yet. It's absurd to think about, and let's be real, the only reason Flint didn't win last year was because of their injuries. The record might not show it, but the 2023-24 Tropics is the best regular season team of all time, and would have been the best overall had they secured the title. Like I said, Giannis is Giannis. Put him down for 43 plus fantasy points this year. Sengun had a sad ending to his All-DBL campaign last season, but he averaged nearly 31 fantasy points at 21 years old. The Jokic upside is clearly there, and I expect him to, at the very least, maintain his 29-5 average, but we could be seeing those numbers increase across the board. He will be the best big man to own in Dynasty, and one of the best period within 3 years. Trey might have also hit his ceiling as a DBL performer, but with DeJounte gone, his 30 FP TDs a game could surely increase. There's a possibility he can get to 33 this season. Chet is also literally just a second-year player at this point, so his potential is staggeringly dangerous. 27 fantasy points as a rook is nuts. With Giddey gone and more development expected, I'm confident he'll be over 30. Hopefully he can stay healthy because I still have question marks about that, but playing in all 82 games last season certainly helps dismiss my claims. We're all waiting for the Mobley breakout, but it's hard to complain when he averaged 28 fantasy points last year. Even if his numbers have steadily been like 15 and 9, I'm trying to see a 20 and 10 season out of him and arguably more, and he's still young as hell, so it can very well occur soon, but if he doesn't do that this year, he might not ever reach that next level as an offensive threat that we've been dying to see. Still, he's increased his fantasy point average every season, so over 30 is not out of the question for him at all. I just hope he can also remain healthy for a majority of the year. It feels like I've been saying the same thing for Ant-Man 3 years straight too, so I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I gotta see more of an improvement to his fantasy numbers to salivate over him. In real life, he's already arrived, and he's still only scratching the surface, but Jordan's son needs to be in 30 fantasy point per game conversations instead of averaging the same amount as a 36-year-old DeMar DeRozan. I believe this is finally the year though, and suspect around 28 to 29 fantasy points. Next up comes Paolo, and it's hard to ask for much more from the guy in year 2. He made a 4 fantasy point leap and became an all-star with the Magic. If he can increase his fantasy average by just like 2 more points or so, he's going to be dominant this season alone. Finally comes J-Dub, and with Giddey gone and more development on the horizon, it wouldn't be surprising to see him average somewhere from 25 to 26 fantasy points. Even if he marginally improves or stays at 23 fantasy points, that's pretty spectacular for your final keeper. Like I said, Cam's core is absolutely legit. These guys are all going to be good, and like 7 out of 8 of them will probably be averaging 26 plus. It's scary because most of them still have so much more room left to grow. How could I not predict Cam for first with a team like this? These keepers are flawless. Cam has made his mark as the best drafter in the league, and this year's band of draftees will continue to support that notion. Cam didn't pick until 15, the first year I think ever that the Tropics didn't have a first round pick. And somehow, someway, this league let the reigning MVP select Zubac at 15 and Nurkic at 28. Zubac averaged 23 fantasy points last year, and Paul George's absence might only mean more scoring opportunities for the big fella. At the very least, he'll match his output from last year, which should make him a top 5 pick on fantasy point average alone. I understand the hesitation with Nurkic as well, it's why I passed on him myself the past 2 years, but letting him fall to the 3rd round is nuts after he averaged 25 fantasy points last time out. Yeah, I don't think he's gonna play in 76 games again either, but you're telling me there's 27 people that should have been taken over him in the fucking first ever 12-team draft? Dude, what the fuck are we doing? That's an easy 2 for 2 already. I don't think he's going to be all that this season. I mean, he's hovered the 21 to 22 mark for like the past 4 years at least, and will likely shed some of that with DeJounte Murray joining the Pelicans and taking over primary ball handling duties. I'm going to guess around 20 fantasy points, but still, it feels like kind of a steal considering where Flint selected him. Their 4th pick was Bobby Portis, and I feel like I've just been burned by him too many times to give a shit about rostering him now. He had a down season, but I'm sure because I wanted nothing to do with him this year, he'll revert back to 23 fantasy points. It remains to be seen if he'll get more minutes or a larger role, but if Brook or anyone in that front court is forced to miss time, he should put up some good numbers. Their last pick at 58 brings us Tyus Jones, a man that Cam drafted last season with the 15th pick. He'll probably put up his usual 18 to 19 fantasy points, maybe a bit less with so many ball-dominant players in Phoenix, maybe a bit more considering they're all going to draw out more defenders, I don't know. It's a pretty praiseworthy pick for it being so close to the end and not having a great menu to choose from, but at the same time I can see him being pretty lackluster for huge chunks of the campaign. At the end of the day though, at least half of these guys will perform, and if they don't, it doesn't matter. Cam's keepers are so good that he can be carried to the semifinals on their performances alone. The Tropics draft was still a top 2 draft though, and we already know Cam's got one of the smartest minds in all of fantasy to produce trades and stealthy wire analysis. It's going to be a difficult path to traverse, playing in Group A and battling off so many other strong opponents, but this is undeniably a powerhouse team, and not only for the next several months, but the next several years. Injuries are the only thing holding Flint, Michigan back, but aside from that and having to put an end to the Knights' reign, there is nothing standing in the Tropics' way. Now that the standings have been explained in great detail, let's move over to who I believe will be 2025's award winners. I have a Knights Tropics finals with the Tropics getting revenge and winning their first chip. Conference title winners will be the Tropics in the East and Stars in the West, since I have them finishing with the best records in their divisions. Sexiest keepers is going to be between Josh and Gian for me. Josh has Jalen Green, but Gian I think will be repeating. Although I don't love his keepers, it's a lot of the same players as last year, plus a few upgrades, such as Tyler Hero, who's not half bad looking. Most improved should be between Ant and Alec, as this award is usually just a two-way race, but I also like the idea of who will improve most from season's beginning to season's end, although there's no way to truly predict that. I'm going to give the edge to Ant, though. I like Alec's direction, and he should ultimately be much better than he was last year, but you gotta remember that the Gems are in Group C with the McLovins, Brawlers, and Nice, who I think are all considerably worse than the Gems at this moment. Plus, Ant only had one W last year compared to the Pronghorns 3, so he's got a larger gap of wins to help his case. When it comes to all dumbass, it's never pleasant projecting who's going to make some less than stellar decisions before the year actually starts, but it's also a fun challenge to predict. First up, I have to go with Josh. I think he's doing the right thing and going about his rebuild in the correct manner, but Jesus fucking Christ, this team might not win a game. The Stars from 2022 went 0-19 and had a better roster than this McLovin squad by far. It's kind of expected when you're tanking this hard. Plus, their draft was just too reliant on going young and being bad. Like, Tijan Salon, seriously? The second member of the 2025 All Dumbass team will be Gian, in my opinion. He just narrowly escaped this fate last year, but now he's got a worse team with a few bad picks in the draft and undeserved keepers as well. Anything can happen, but these examples don't bode well for his chances at being left off. Finally, I'm gonna go with Alec. I couldn't in good faith choose Matt or CJ as new members, or at the very least as expansion teams who didn't have much of anything to work with, so I think league members will understand their plight and cut them some slack. At the very least, they will with Matt, because CJ kind of knows everything there is to know about our league already, so I also thought about choosing Anthony, because, I think a few of his keepers were mistakes, and there's usually a big move or something every year that puts him in this category, but I'm gonna go and stay with the Pronghorns GM. He didn't have a terrible draft, but I think he's gonna make some questionable trades, as we saw last year with him. He also didn't make any moves this offseason or entertain any offers in any way, so I think that could make him repeat as an All Dumbass member. But Dumbass of the Year will be Josh, whether he deserves it or not. If he wins one game or less, or just has the worst record and is truly that awful, it's gonna reflect in the votes. Best Draft is an award that always looks so much different from the start of the year until the end, but I think Cam is going to take the honors with his third ever. I think Gio's got a pretty good chance as long as Bezelas can show some upside and that he deserves to be a keeper for any team next season, but there's more up in the air uncertainty with some of those picks than there is with the Tropics. If Bobby Portis and Tyus Jones don't amount to much, Gio could easily snag this with his mix of young dudes and proven players too. I will throw my own draft into the ring because if it goes right, which never happens, but if it does, it could wind up being a special year of selections. But I still believe this is Cam's award to lose. Trader of the Year can go to a lot of different folks, but I think I have to hand it to Cam and the Trops for being one of the very few teams to get anything done this offseason, plus they're going to be busy later in the schedule as they look to win their first championship. The Knights should be right there since I think it's safe to say Joe has earned the title of best trader in the league, and I'm going to shout out Gio as I expect some big moves from the Peach Creek front office this season too. Alright, last second, I decided that I'm going to actually change my GM of the Year vote, so this is unheard of, literally about to be done with the video, but I had a change of heart. I originally had Gary as my GM of the Year, and I think that's what I kind of had before the draft. I'm not too thrilled about his draft. I don't really like his team right now with all of his injuries and everything, and the injury to Kawhi that happened. Honestly, if I could probably go back and switch all of the standings and redo everything, he'd probably be 6 or 5 instead of number 4 because of how detrimental it looks like these injuries might be to his team. Plus, I don't think he's got a great draft. He will have to do some incredible GMing to really win this award and finish as high as I did have him, which is possible because he's a really good DBL member and GM, but I'm going to go with myself. I think that I deserved it last year, I think. Cam definitely earned it and deserved it as well, but I think that was the best year I've ever GM'd, and I think that overall as a manager, it's really hard to compete with the Knights in their front office. Of course, the Tropics are next level too with the things Cam is getting done over there in Flint, Michigan. Incredible stuff. I think Gio's got a good chance. Of course, I've got him being finishing in third and being a contender for all of these awards and the championship in general. Mike, I would give him some love as well. He's one of the better playoff teams that is in the league this year and everything. I don't like the way this recording is going. It's off the dome, so I'm really trying my best to sound professional, but it sounds terrible. I think Mike probably needs some more moves and more deals to get done. Last year he wasn't as attentive as maybe some other guys that were probably in the race for GM of the Year, so I think he needs to get a little bit more done. And as far as James goes, he's been a great team for pretty much every season in the league aside from the 1 year he decided to intentionally tank. So he's always been in the playoffs. The only problem is he's never won a GM of the Year, and that as well, I think, constitutes with the fact that he doesn't really get a lot of deals done himself. He doesn't make a lot of moves generally, so he has a good team, but I think he needs to be a better manager to win that award. That could be this year, but I think Joe and Cam are really going to be, neck and neck for this. Ultimately, I'm going to go with Joe and the Knights. And let me just apologize for how terrible this audio and recording was, but let's go to the next award. All Fantasy is a bit self-explanatory as well, but that third team could be anyone. Joe and Cam are my locks for 2025. Cam will be dominant once again, and Joe hasn't missed an All Fantasy team yet, but that third spot should be between Mike, Gio, James, and Gary. It's easy to choose the best team in the West, who I think will be the stars, but I'm actually going to choose Gio. I think that if he can manage at the level he did the past 2 seasons, and his team can stay healthy, we should be looking at a 13-plus win team that could go toe-to-toe with any other squad in the DBL. Gary, James, and Mike definitely could be in there though, and I wouldn't be surprised at all. Lastly is the coveted MVP, and again it's a little anticlimactic, but I've got Cam going back-to-back. His team is looking to improve on their fantasy point total from last year, which was already the most of all time, and people want to see Cam win and do well, so that's my prediction. That'll do it here for the Season 6 projections video. I love doing a deep dive on my thoughts and guessing how the year will unfold. Good luck to all the teams and may the pursuit of a new title begin.